Good to be with you all this morning. Thank you for welcoming me. Just a clarification, I'm very part-time with the campaign that's working to end solitary confinement in New York State, and also, so it's very part-time, and also the spiritual direction practice is just getting up and running. I need to find some directees here in Buffalo. So I'm very much starting out on that, but very, very much looking forward to it as well. Would you pray with me? Creator of all life, thank you for this time and this space to be together as much as we're able to be together in this time. We do ask that you open the eyes of our hearts, that you would speak to each of us, that you would continue to heal us and strengthen us, that we would be able to recognize your presence and welcome it. And we ask this through Christ. Amen. Has anyone heard of Anthony Ray Hinton? I want to tell you a story about him, but just wondering if you've read anything by him. Anthony Ray Hinton, anyone? Okay, he is a man who's from Alabama who was wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death in 1985. He goes by Ray. And Ray spent 30 years on Alabama's death row for a crime he didn't commit. Police and prosecutors at the time of his arrest really were basically indifferent to his innocence. They really knew they didn't have the evidence they needed, but what they were counting on was that he was a black man in Alabama and that the jury would be all white and that he was poor and couldn't afford proper legal counsel. And so they took that bet and they were right. He was convicted even though they really had almost nothing on him at all. So he spent this time on death row, and for the first 3 years of his time on the row, he was silent. He spoke to no one except his family and his dearest friends who did come to visit him faithfully. Being faced with just such bald racism and injustice, he was filled with anger, understandably, and even hatred, and he had completely given up on his faith. And then there was one night that through the darkness from one of the cells nearby, he heard a man weeping. And turned out that this man was just simply inconsolable over the loss of his mother, having heard this news while isolated behind bars. And Ray had a particularly close relationship with his own mother. She was really the most important person in his life, and he loved her more than anyone else. And so his heart in that moment just cracked open, and he had an access to his own humanity that he hadn't really had since he had been put in prison. And he reached out to this man. He called out to him. He found out what was going on, and offered him sympathy for his loss. And as he opened that up, other men started calling out, "I'm sorry for your loss, like hang in there, man." And it turned out to be kind of a domino effect that they were able to, in the ways that were possible in that situation, offer some kind of consolation and solidarity with each other. And so he found that he got his voice back, he got his sense of humor back, and in a significant way, he got himself back. His mother had taught him to be a person of compassion, and he began to reach out. He began to build relationships and friendships on the row. And he even in time reached out to a young man who was a young white man who was a son of a Ku Klux Klansman who had lynched a 14-year-old boy, and that was why he had received the death penalty. And he was able, in the magnitude of his spirit that he had opened, able to reach out to this person and even invite him to a book club that he had started. It seemed that he was able to see that in this most dehumanizing system, the thing that mattered the most was to honor the humanity and the dignity of each person and to be able to behave as if we are all already one. Ray had that vision and he lived it while he was behind bars, and he certainly lives it now that he's able to, now that he's free and is able to speak to audiences around the country. In a way, it was as if he became kind of transparent, and the light of divine love was flowing through him powerfully. And that was undeniable, even to the guards who also respected him and admired him. Anthony Ray Hinton found that to survive, to keep even from losing his own mind, he needed to feed it with something good. To keep from losing himself, he somehow had to shift his perspective, and that happened that night and over time as he continued to, through God's grace, be able to practice compassion and friendship. And it seemed that he had become receptive to God in a way that hadn't been available to him in his great and understandable anger. In our Acts passage from today, I had to chuckle a little bit as I hear Jesus' friends saying, okay, so now you'll restore the kingdom to Israel. Now is it time? Like, are you going to take your rightful throne and rule and vindicate our nation? It's almost like they kind of see the crucifixion as like a really unfortunate kind of hiccup, but now we can kind of get back to the plan that we were hoping for. And it's easy for us to look back and say, like, how could they not get it after he told them so much about the kingdom of God? And yet really we're the same, right? I mean, it's not easy to get it. And honestly, it's a fair question from where they're standing. If anything, they have more reason than we to desire that kind of thing. They were an occupied people under the thumb of the Roman Empire, and longing for self-determination and freedom was, again, understandable. And so it makes sense that they would be asking their beloved teacher, now is it time? And yet Jesus seems to kind of brush this aside and say, no, but you will receive power and you will be my witnesses. Of course, we know that this predicts the coming of the Spirit in the next chapter on the day of Pentecost, when the Spirit comes like a hurricane and looks kind of like tongues of fire on the disciples. And then their powerful and joyful retelling of the story of Jesus, his healing and teaching and dying and rising, and the ways that they loved each other and the ways that they loved new followers of Christ, and then continued the story. So we know that's what it meant for them at that moment, but what does it mean for us to receive power from the Creator and to be Christ's witnesses? Now, that question could be answered well in a lot of ways, in a lot of different ways, but today I would like to look particularly at our receptivity, our willingness to receive the power and the love of God so that we can be witnesses. When the disciples ask if now, finally, Jesus would bring back some kind of political power to Israel, they're focused on the thing that they think they need to move forward. But obviously Jesus is offering them, promising them something different. And like Jesus tends to do, is asking them to adjust their expectations. Now, I don't know if you can relate to this, but even particularly at a time like this, I tend to get pretty tied up with my own expectations and frustrated when they're not met, whether it's expectations I have of myself or how my gifts should be used in the world, or maybe expectations of my community, of people who live in my state, attitudes I think that my neighbors should have. And really, I don't know if you experience this, but it's really helpful for me when a trusted friend can help me to see a bigger picture and adjust and get perspective. It helps me to loosen my grip on the way I think things should be. And that's not to say that expectations are bad. Obviously, we can't avoid having them. There's no way we can move through life without them, without having expectations. But just to notice that holding on tightly to them can sometimes block our capacity to allow and be open to something new that's coming, and maybe particularly God's unexpected movement. Now, traditionally, the Acts passage, the ascension of Christ into heaven, completes this kind of narrative circle, right? Of Jesus as a mediator of the divine for all of humanity. The divine takes on flesh and experiences all of human life, experiences joy and the pleasure of eating food and deep friendships, and then also great sorrow and betrayal and suffering and death and rising. And then with the ascension, in returning to God, it's as if Christ brings humanity into God. And at the same time, leaves his followers to carry on the work of love, healing, embracing outcasts, living as Jesus lived. And the arc of Jesus' story is to become our story. Those who follow Christ in life and through death will also follow him into boundless life with God. I want to take this traditional understanding and give it, maybe add another layer, maybe underneath it. Christ bringing humanity directly into God's life, into the very self of God, is a powerful image of oneness and reconciliation, especially when we're coming from a standpoint of being alienated from God, or believing that we are at odds with the divine intention for our lives. And certainly we experience this. We, as human beings, obviously, we make choices, and we also suffer oppression and harm that alienate us from each other, from the practice of love, from the experience of love, and even of divine love. And yet, or maybe in addition, my experience with centering prayer and with teachers of this contemplative way of praying has also shown me that we are already in God, that we are not separated, that at a deeper level, the divine spirit has always been present in us, in all of us, and that this spirit continuously breathes in us, and that the invitation is to open willingly and often to that presence, to God's presence with us and within us. So just a little context on centering prayer. Has anyone practiced centering prayer, have some familiarity? A few people. For those who don't have that familiarity, it's an ancient form of Christian meditation. It's very simple, but not easy. But it's a simple practice of releasing our thoughts, releasing feelings, even bodily sensations during a 20-minute period of silence. And that period of silence is intended for our opening. We enter that silence with receptivity to what God is doing within us. And we just continue during that time. Whenever we are thinking or noticing that we're thinking, we release that thought or that emotion with the idea of consenting. We're consenting to the action of God within, even though generally we can't tell that anything is happening during that time. So it's not, you're not trying to have an experience, a particular experience, but simply to be open to God's presence. So from the perspective of centering prayer, the image of the risen Christ being taken into the clouds is simply another affirmation from God of humanity's oneness with the Holy One. And in this, it's in this light that the outrageous claim at the end of our Ephesians passage makes a little more sense to me. Did you notice what is said at the end of that passage? As Christ's body on earth, the church is the fullness of the one who fills all of creation. I mean, this can be hard to embrace, I think, for many of us who have seen how the church has failed and done great harm and even been quite violent through our history and probably hurt a lot of us over time. But it seems to me we can only embrace this from a deep trust that the holy dwells in us and that we cannot be separate from this presence, only unaware of it or resistant to it or turning from it, but not separate. And I believe then that there's a real deep connection, a very deep connection between a regular prayer of release and receptivity and this incredible claim that we, as Christ's body, can in fact allow the glory of God, even the fullness of love, to flow through us. That healing and reconciling power is already flowing, and we simply need to say yes. Because God will not coerce or force us. But we can catch that same transforming vision that Ray Hinton had on death row. That we are already one with one another, and that God is present in every place, especially places of great pain, and that we have access to this unending flow of love. Now, of course, mystics and contemplatives of every tradition in every century, in every part of the globe, have known this, but not everyone knew it, and in our time, for sure, not everybody, not all of us, find it particularly easy to believe that God is closer than our own breath. It can be hard to embrace that sometimes. So we continue to need encouragement and reminders to embrace this profound goodness, this gift, the gift of the truth that we are embraced by endless love since the day we were born and even before you were born. And we do need to practice. We need to practice opening to this gift of divine presence, to practice saying yes. And it's not just for the Anthony Ray Hintons of the world, but possible for every person to open and be receptive in this way. So it's in this posture of receptivity, of willingness to let everything go, because we know in the end we will have to let everything go, and to release everything into God. It's in this practice, in this posture, that it becomes more clear on earth that God has placed everything under Christ's feet. I would like to invite those of you who'd be willing and able, maybe if you don't have children, I think it would probably be difficult for kids, but I'd like to invite you to just practice very briefly, maybe about 4 minutes, of this silent prayer with me. The thing that I didn't mention before is that the way we return to silence is by using a sacred word. So don't stress about what word it is. It needs to be just one simple, one syllable: love, yes, peace. Very simple. It doesn't need to have any special meaning. It's better if it doesn't, because the whole point of it is to help you let go of whatever thought you're noticing, whatever feeling you're noticing, whatever bodily sensation is happening, just to release that as they come, very, very gently, saying the word and letting that go and returning to silence. Any questions about the process of how this works? Is that clear? Please just flag me down if you want clarification on anything. I'm going to go to the next page just in case I don't see anybody. Okay. All right, why don't we try that? I have a timer here. You'll hear a bell. We can go into silence. Try to be comfortable but alert. You can close your eyes and simply say yes to the presence of love within you. And the bell will also ring to take us out of this silence. Thank you, and peace be with you.